couple weeks ago, before Christmas, I actually had a different homily prepared. So I wrote this homily on the sleeping St. Joseph, and so I wrote it, and I uploaded it to the podcast, Catholic Latte, so I definitely encourage you to watch that kind of later on. But then all of a sudden it hit like Saturday afternoon, and it occurred to me, I don't really want to talk about the sleeping St. Joseph. I thought I might do something a little more fun, a little more exciting, to kind of talk about the Christmas season in light of a really famous movie, which I'm sure everyone's seen. Came out in 2013, Walt Disney's Frozen. So just out of curiosity, who's seen Frozen? Actually, the question should be, who hasn't seen Frozen? Really? Well, guess what you're doing tonight? In case you don't know, Frozen is my favorite movie of all time. Not even like top 10, top 5, like number 1 with a bullet. For 2 reasons. First of all, because it's awesome. But secondly, because it's actually a really beautiful and attractive way to explain salvation history from a Christian perspective. So, to understand the point, I want to hit a couple bullet points with regards to Catholic theology, right? So, obviously, the very beginning of the Bible is the book of Genesis. And you hear how the world is created, and then you hear a story about how our first parents, Adam and Eve, kind of do their thing, right? So, before original sin, what you hear is that Adam and Eve are naked and unafraid. Naked and unafraid. And that's basically a poetic way of saying they were vulnerable, but secure in their vulnerability. Vulnerable, but secure in their vulnerability. Then all of a sudden, original sin enters the scene, right? So because of this great act of distrust in God the Father and His providence, they start to bicker amongst themselves, so tension with regards to each other. All of a sudden now there's suffering, there's death, there's pain, there's inclination towards sin, so tension within yourself. And also, they start to become afraid of God. They hide their nakedness using fig leaves, so tension even in their relationship with God. But God doesn't abandon them. He clothes them, He protects them, and promises that one day a Savior will come. And you put a pause on that and think about the saints, especially the saints in the early church, right? So what you find is that, especially again in the context of the early church, the saints often describe sin as being a state of alienation or separation. So Augustine, he says, sin is like being caved in on oneself. And the poet Dante, instead of describing hell as a fiery pit, he says, hell is sort of like an icy wasteland. And on top of that, he says that sin is like being frozen. So it's kind of an interesting thing, So up and down the history of the church, especially in the early church, what you find is that this image of like snow and ice and being frozen is actually a metaphor for sin, and original sin in particular. So you hold that thought and you think about the story, right? I know it's a long time probably since you've seen the movie, unless you're parents, in which case you probably saw it like yesterday. But it revolves around like 2 sisters who are also princesses of this fictional kingdom called Arendelle. So there's Elsa, who's loosely based on the main character of the story, the Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. So she has this magical power to manipulate snow and ice in this beautiful sort of way, right? And there's her sister Anna, who has no powers. But at the same time, she's like the Christ figure in the story, as you'll see in just a moment, right? So the movie begins when they're young. They're young, they're fun, they're carefree. They are naked and unafraid. Vulnerable but secure in their vulnerability, as underlined by that song, Do You Want to Build a Snowman, right? Then all of a sudden there's this accident, right? So there's this accident which happens when they're at play. Now there's fear, now there's tension, now there's dysfunction. Separation and alienation, culminating with Elsa trapping herself behind a locked door. Not for a short period of time, actually, but for a period of years. And this lasts for a really long time until the occasion of her coronation. So Elsa, because she is the elder sister, eventually she is crowned Queen of Arendelle, right? And so this coincides with a really famous song, For the First Time in Forever. If you think back to the movie, it's sung as a duet, right? Sung by the 2 sisters. And so basically it's meant to portray contrasting attitudes with regards to this singular event. So Anna, she's like completely psyched. Super excited because the doors of the castle are finally going to be open. People are going to start arriving. In contrast, Elsa is terrified. She's scared. And why? Because the doors of the castle are finally going to be open. People are going to start arriving. So same event, but different reactions to the same occurrence, which is ironic because Elsa's the one who's about to be crowned queen. But Bishop Robert Barron talks about this, right? He says one of the downsides of original sin is that we see people in a skewed sort of way. I see my neighbor not as someone to be loved, but rather as someone to be feared. And this gives rise to all sorts of dysfunction in our relationships, sins of gossip and slander and anger and whatnot, right? So this is kind of what happens. And all of a sudden, things come to a head. It becomes too unbearable for Elsa. She banishes herself to a faraway mountain, this icy mountain. And she sings this really famous song, which obviously is... Okay, have you actually seen the movie? Let it go, right? Let it go. Now, interesting thing about let it go. If you look on the internet, people say, oh, let it go is all about freedom and emancipation and whatever. It's not really. Because if you look at the song, right, so you listen, it's kind of catchy and whatnot, and won the Academy Award. But at the same time, if you look at what's happening when that song's going on, so Elsa, she changes her hair, and she changes her clothes, and she builds a bunch of things, but at the end of the day, she's alone in a castle made of ice. So she says, oh, I'm alone and free. It's like, no, honey, you're just alone, right? So separation, dysfunction, the very essence of sin, right? And eventually, this comes to her attention. This intervention, her Alcoholics Anonymous moment. All of a sudden, Anna arrives. Oh, by the way, sin doesn't just affect you, it affects the world, right? So the kingdom of Arendelle is completely encased in ice. Thanks a lot, right? And all of a sudden it hits her. Oh, I'm such a fool, I can't be free, I can't escape the storm inside of me. And then all of a sudden, as a result of that, this admission of her powerlessness in the face of sin, this blast of ice shoots forth from her body into the heart of her sister. This moment where Jesus Christ takes upon himself the sins of the world. And all of a sudden, Anna starts changing. The temperature in her body starts to plummet. Her skin becomes pale like Elsa's skin. Her hair becomes dazzling white like Elsa's hair. And at a certain point, she finds herself trapped behind locked doors, not unlike how Elsa was trapped at the very beginning of the movie. So you put it all together, Anna becomes Elsa. And what is that but the great mystery of the Incarnation? Jesus Christ becomes like us in all things but sin, which is the primary mystery of the Christmas season. You're welcome. But wait, there's more. So at the end, there's this life and death situation where all of a sudden Anna sacrifices herself such that Elsa might live, but not before becoming a solid block of ice. And what is that but emblematic of the crucifixion? But because it's a Disney movie, she's dead for like 10 seconds, and then she comes back to life. And what is that but the resurrection? But what you'll notice, besides the fact I've watched this movie clearly way too many times, is the way in which she comes back to life. So it begins with this emanation of heat, which begins in the center of her heart and extends to the rest of her body. And for me, it reminded me of John chapter 19, the Gospel of John chapter 19. After Jesus Christ dies, he's pierced in his heart by that lance by that centurion, right? And from his heart flows blood and water, symbolic of the Holy Eucharist and the sacrament of baptism, or, generally speaking, the sacraments of the Holy Catholic Church. Visible signs instituted by Christ to convey grace, the primary means by which salvation is brought to the world. I remember shortly after I saw this movie, I was talking to my spiritual director, and he kind of shared with me this reflection about the nature of sin. Basically what he said was that whenever there's a failure to love, I could love, I should love, but I fail to correspond to the invitation to love, a certain poison, if you will, sort of obtains in our souls, which ironically further compromises our ability to love, which is not good because we're made to make a gift of ourselves, sharing God's blessed life, God who is love incarnate. And obviously that's a problem. We're powerless in the face of that particular dynamic. We need Jesus Christ to save us. And the way he does it primarily is through the sacraments of the Holy Catholic Church. Right? So baptism restores us to new life, confession restores us to right relationship with God, and the Eucharist is food for the journey. The Lord gives us his own body, blood, soul, and divinity to help us become the persons he's calling us to be. And in a funny sort of way, this happens at the end of the movie. So basically, when the Paschal mystery takes place, the suffering, death, resurrection, and glorification of Christ the Lord in the person of Anna, all of a sudden, Elsa changes. She's finally able to appropriate that one line, which is the motto of the entire movie. And that motto is, "You're killing me." An act of true love will thaw a frozen heart. And then what happens? All of a sudden, things change. Right? She looks at herself like, right, love. The primacy of love, and now I have the ability to love. As a result of which the entire kingdom is thawed of its eternal winter. Salvation comes to the kingdom in which salvation comes to the world, as foretold in the book of Genesis.